So, Reba, let me tell you something about this show. Somehow, the writing still holds up even for a show about a South Texas divorcee born and raised in Oklahoma. And don't get me wrong, this show still has plenty of moments of distasteful dialogue, but for a show about the South that plays into Southern stereotypes, I was genuinely very impressed with how good this show was, especially since it premiered back in 2001. Welcome to today's video where we're talking about Reba, the Texas-based sitcom from 2001. My name is Zach and I definitely watch way too much TV. And if you watch too much TV too, make sure you click that like button, that notification bell, and that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on future videos. So I first came across Reba when I was living with my boyfriend at his parents' house during the early days of the pandemic, and his mom loves Gilmore Girls. So that would very frequently be on the TV when we'd come downstairs from our offices at the end of the workday. And right after reruns of Gilmore Girls would end, reruns of Reba would begin, and I never really paid all that much attention, and I never really watched a full episode of Reba while they would air the rerun. So I was very much under the impression that this was a very episodic show and not serialized in any way. And boy, was I wrong. While the show does not have a serialized plot that strings every single episode together into one larger final plot moment each season, it is way more connected than I thought it would be. So I finally watched all 6 seasons of Reba since they were recently added to Netflix. And over on my TikTok, I do a series where I talk about canceled TV shows. So naturally, I did a little bit of extra digging and a little bit of extra research on the history of the show and its fight with cancellation. What's super interesting about this show in particular is that it survived a very cataclysmic merger of UPN and WB, which were 2 networks, one owned by Warner Bros. And one owned by CBS back in 2006, which axed a ton of bubble shows. And if you don't know what a bubble show is, it's a series that could have gone either way regarding renewal or cancellation. Anyway, the show was pretty popular while it was on air, and everybody was so disappointed when it was announced in 2006 that the upcoming 6th season of Reba would not only be the final season, but it would also be a shortened 13-episode season. And in November of 2006, Reba began airing its final season on the newly created network, the CW. What exactly was so charming about this series, and why is it still kind of popular today and almost having a resurgence because of its airing on Netflix? For one, I think what caught so many people's eye was just how niche it was compared to other sitcoms. At the time, there weren't a ton of blended family sitcoms, and this was kind of a newer market to emerge into. The show followed Reba Hart, a single mom that worked too hard and loved her kids and never stopped. And she had gentle hands and the heart of a fighter because she was what? A survivor. Okay, jokes aside, the show followed Reba Hart, a newly divorced, now single mom, because her husband had cheated on her with his dental assistant, Barbara Jean, also referred to as BJ. Okay. What can I say about Barbara Jean? She's honestly one of the best and worst characters in the show, and at times she's very insufferably annoying, and truly I applaud Reba for tolerating her as well as she did throughout all 6 seasons of the show. But also, she's one of the best characters, like I said, because she continued to be there for her family, showed up when it mattered, and never wavered in who she was and what she stood for, albeit there were times that she stood for something questionable, but nevertheless, she never wavered in what she stood for. She also had some of the best moments from a show that tried to have some more comedic moments, but was really more of a slice of life TV series than a proper sitcom, in my opinion at least. And in one episode in particular that I'm going to talk about, Barbara Jean and Brock are regularly seeing a couples therapist because they're having a rough patch in their relationship, and Reba goes to chat with their therapist for whatever inappropriate reason she thought was justifiable in meddling in her ex-husband's relationship. Well, the therapist was played by then heartthrob James Denton, who you might know from Desperate Housewives playing Mike Delfino, and Barbara Jean had the hots for their therapist James Denton, and that's why they had to switch their therapists later in the episode. And then it turns out the therapist ended up having a thing for Reba. Well, Reba, being the kind soul and begrudgingly loving Barbara Jean, but never going to admit that to herself, she couldn't bring herself to date James Denton, even though Barbara Jean was married to Brock, Reba's ex-husband of all people. But basically, anytime Barbara Jean would see James Denton's character, she'd yank him in for a kiss, and while that was definitely a form of SA, at the time the comedy was there, and James Denton's character did not seem all that bothered by the gesture. I guess where I'm going with that is that Reba has too kind of a heart, and her dynamic with Barbara Jean is one of the best parts of the show because Barbara Jean is just so outrageous with how much she loves Reba, and Reba cannot handle that amount of love from somebody who kind of imploded her entire life. And in the end of that episode, Barbara Jean ends up scolding Reba for passing up on that man in particular. Her reasoning is because Barbara Jean can't have him herself. I think more funny moments from the show that really show how progressive it was, but problematically progressive at times, were a lot of their notions about LGBTQIA plus people. There's one episode in particular where Van is trying to sign with a very high profile football agent, and he's on the brink of doing it. And one of the things he ends up doing while trying to sign with her is he ends up lying to the agent, who's played by Hot in Cleveland star Wendy Malick, to secure that spot. He tells Wendy's character that Reba is a lesbian, and Wendy is playing a lesbian as well, and Wendy's character ends up asking Reba on a date after she comes over to Van's place to meet his entire family. Well, to help Van secure this deal, Reba ends up playing along, even though she knows in her heart that it's wrong to be lying to Wendy about being a lesbian herself. And throughout that episode and that whole interaction, she is actually trying to tell Wendy the entire time that she's not actually a lesbian. So by the end of the episode, Reba comes clean to Wendy because Wendy is coming to pick Reba up for their date. Reba ends up confessing the next day to Wendy when she comes over to pick her up for their date. She does still tell Wendy that she would love to get to know her and be friends because they share a similar story about being left behind. The episode is actually one of my favorites because nowhere in the whole interaction between Wendy and Reba does it make it a weird thing to be gay. The episode's actually a lot more about Reba feeling incredibly guilty for leading this woman on, and especially in a southern town, and she understands how dishonorable it is for her to be lying about her own sexuality to a woman that is opening her heart and searching for love, and was so open about that herself. She even goes on to tell Wendy how lucky any woman would be to meet her and date her. There are also a ton of great episodes related to storylines on alcoholism and addiction, and honestly, how the writers of the show use humor-driven story to tell this tale is refreshing, especially for such taboo topics in the early 2000s. In later seasons, Cheyenne discovers that she is an alcoholic, and any other show I think probably would have over-dramatized the storyline of alcoholism, but in Reba, they use humor to introduce the topic, and when it's time to get serious about the topic, they spare no expense of talent to let these actors just run with it and do their job and share the story authentically, or at least what's authentic for the character. I think what really made this show special though was how well it normalized being a blended family like the Hart family. Reba really emphasizes the importance of having a healthy relationship and understanding with your ex and being co-parents with them. And for a time where divorce rates were rising and more blended families were coming to be, it's really cool that Reba got to be on the forefront of that, showing love in a blended family that was originally broken apart by infidelity. Another thing that I think Reba did very well was how it discussed adults dealing with depression. I watched a ton of teen dramas, and so many of them deal with depression or anxiety or just other mental illnesses in such a rudimentary way that wasn't really effective in detailing how it might impact you as an adult, or it showed only one extreme to how it can manifest. And while it's important to show that on its own, you rarely see adults in media dealing with mental illnesses, especially not in the early 2000s when it's such a foreign subject to so many people. Brock Hart, the dad, ends up addressing his midlife crisis in one-on-one therapy sessions, and his psychiatrist diagnoses him with depression. So he's prescribed some medication, and Barbara Jean is freaking out and thinking that because he needs pills to be happy, she's inadequate and unable to make him happy herself. Reba addresses this with Barbara Jean, and she tries to get her to understand that this isn't something that either of them can fix, and it's just something that she needs to be there for Brock with. She needs to show him the support that he needs. And something about this storyline is really heartwarming. I think it's because it's the first time since their divorce that we really see Reba acknowledging her friendship with Brock, and how even though they aren't married, their relationship has evolved, and they stayed best friends even as they moved on to other people. I think overall this is probably another one of my favorite storylines in the series because it's also one of the only times that we get to see Brock be vulnerable and really recognize the damage and pain he caused his family, and it's really the start of him reckoning with all of that and becoming a better father, a better husband, and a better friend to all the main cast members. Okay, so enough about all the great things and really cool ways this show is at the forefront of taboo topics on TV. One thing that I really don't love about the show is the pacing of a lot of the episodes. Oftentimes, the episodes are only 15 minutes of nonsense exposition for the plot to only then have the climax happen at around the 18-minute mark in the episode. And in those 3 to 4 remaining minutes of our 22-minute episode, the entire conflict is resolved with a quippy, quirky, or silly post-credit scene to wrap up the episode. The pacing just doesn't work out for me a lot of times in episodes episodes like that. It feels like they resolve the conflict in a way that's way too quick, especially with big topics like alcoholism or depression. I'd almost rather they span it across a couple more episodes to really dive deep into the storyline. And I understand that this is a sitcom, but it does choose to touch on these topics, so they should really touch on them and expand the story in a way that's even more authentic than what was there in the 22 minutes. Other times they would just wrap the episode up in one big monologue from Reba herself, who was the central character, a heart-to-heart between two characters, or it would just end the conflict and never be addressed again. But for the most part, the positives really do outweigh the negatives. Other cool things that they address in the show are things like Hurricane Katrina. In one episode, a lot of Hurricane Katrina's survivors and victims make their way up to Houston because they're being sent there because it's not as impacted. And so Reba ends up opening her house to an entire family of people that are really impacted by Hurricane Katrina. So it's really cool to see that interaction, especially in the early 2000s. You also hear a lot about the impending doom of the stock market crash that ends up happening in 2008 in our timeline and how predictable it was. And it's insane to hear about that because a lot of people just were so shocked that it happened. And they also talk about a lot of other important big life events. Some of the other major topics on the show that they talk about are like teen pregnancy, teen marriage, dating after divorce, disabilities, racial injustice, homelessness, and parenting styles. And like I said before, there are a ton of times throughout the series where they touch on a touchy subject and it just doesn't land. But for a country folk focused series based in Houston, Texas in 2001, it's an incredibly progressive and forward-thinking show, and I can't help but applaud it for even going there when so many other shows wouldn't dare. So if you like this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up. Go ahead and leave a comment down below if you've watched Reba or if I've now convinced you to go check out the series. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in the next video.